Okay, welcome to the St Andrews Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Yeah.
The motion that stands before the House this evening is this House believes that capitalism has failed vulnerable groups. We are joined by some excellent speakers tonight, Katherine Sangster and Okafor-Yarwood on the proposition side, and Eamonn, Butler and Prescott on the opposition side. We are aware that this can be a sensitive topic, so in terms of people get heated, so we have a quiet room, which is 103 on this floor, and also Jenny will be available if you have any concerns as well. Before we begin the debate, I invite the training officer to read last week's minutes in the style of Noam Chomsky.
Oh, please stop, old man.
I think we're honoured to have such an esteemed academic with us tonight, especially one who's old enough to remember when capitalism began.
There seems to be some disagreement in the House. We'll have to take a vote by oral acclamation. Ooh. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
Seems rather close. I must consult my sergeant.
Aye.
The minutes are taken as read.
Resign.
Without any further ado, I give the call to the first proposition speaker to give their address defending the motion that stands for the name. Here.
Well, thank you very much for being invited here, and thank you to Sergeant Arms for his wonderful organisation. Before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about how I got into politics, because I think that informs the debate. I didn't do politics at university. This is my very first debate, and I think you're all incredibly lucky to be here and to have that space and time to think about how you were going to go out and change the world and really think about these ideas. I got into politics when I had my children, and I realised that actually it was incredibly difficult to go back to work because childcare is not affordable. And if parents can't go back to well-paid work, their careers stall and they can't provide for their families. So I set up a campaign movement. We were a grassroots movement. We were a movement of mainly mums that campaigned to get childcare on the national agenda, and we made really good progress. And I did that campaign because I believe that well-paid work is the route out of poverty. But that is not going to happen with unregulated capitalism. That has to happen with campaigners and politicians and policymakers that make that happen. Half of working families on universal credit ran out of food this month. Half. Not people who don't work, but people who go out to work ran out of food this month. A third struggle to heat their homes, and a fifth told us that they have to cut down on essential journeys because they can't afford to put petrol in their car. Capitalism has not just failed vulnerable groups, if that's it, statistics. Capitalism has failed us all. The statistics for child poverty in Fife, I probably don't have to tell you probably know, but it's 1 in 4 live in relative poverty and 1 in 5 live in absolute poverty. I sometimes volunteer for food banks, and one of the things that is very noticeable is that you are delivering food parcels to very nice homes with new cars in the driveway and new builds, because what we are living in is an age of insecurity. It's not poverty in the way that we would think about it in some kind of Dickensian manner, but it is soaring costs of food, soaring costs of rent, which I'm sure you all know as students, and the inability to heat your homes. Therefore, this is not an academic question in this room of has capitalism failed vulnerable groups. It's actually failing our friends and our neighbours and us. It's very real. Capitalism can generate lots of wealth and lots of products and lots of things that we all like to have in our lives, but capitalism in itself will not redistribute wealth. That falls to, as I say, campaigners and policy makers, and it falls to a government to make sure that things are fair and things are equal. Unregulated capitalism would lead to profiteering. It would lead to lack of consumer rights, lack of workers' rights, and it's been organisations like the Fabian Society and trade unions and the Labour Party that have regulated capitalism to make it more fair. So I will not stand up here and say that we should do away with capitalism, but what I will stand up here and say is that capitalism in itself does not create a fairer society. That is policymakers and people like us that create that fair society. The other thing that I want to talk about is when we think about how we're going to change society. It is not done by free markets. It is done by governments. And we should think about how we prosper. Certainly, we can all prosper under capitalism, but some people cannot. I spoke about working families, but there are people who cannot work. They simply can't, and they need the protection of us. We need to agree that no one can fall between the gaps. No one can fall below a certain standard. And again, that isn't capitalism that does that. That's democratic socialism. So the last thing I want to say is we cannot prosper as a society if some of us do not. We all have to prosper. So what I would say to you is that capitalism has failed to protect vulnerable groups, and I'd go further and say it's not protecting any of us. Child poverty in the UK costs us 40 billion a year. That's not 40 billion to do away with child poverty, that's 40 billion to mitigate the effects of child poverty. It's costing us all money to not get this right. So thank you very much.
Address, and I'll pass the floor and give you 40 first opposition speaker to start the case for the opposition bench. Hey, hey.
Thank you very much. It's very nice for me to be back in this room because I was a student at St Andrews myself, and I have spent many happy hours in this auditorium. Most of them, I have to say, quietly dozing at the back. But there we are. So let me thank Katherine for that presentation, which I thought was very successful. Mind you, the launch of the Titanic was very successful, but there you are. I think, though, that there's a couple of deceptions going on here. Firstly, I think that capitalism gets loaded with a lot of junk. Capitalism is quite simple. In fact, I wrote about it in a book, which is called, believe it or not, Capitalism. And capitalism is very simple. It's two bits of a word, right? Capital, meaning that you acquire capital goods, factories, plants, equipment, in order to make things more cheaply and make them better. And ism, which is a way of life. So that's what capitalism is about. It's not about all the garbage and the baggage and the dark satanic mills that it's being loaded up with. This is just a fraud. And I think there's also a deception that sometimes we're asked to compare the reality of today's capitalism, such as it is, with the sort of dreamy theory of socialism. Well, I'm prepared to argue on theory, I'm prepared to argue on practice, but I'm not going to pit practice against theory. That's not right. And I think there's an illusion as well that this is actually a capitalist country. It isn't. This is very largely a socialist country because the government takes 45.6% of the gross national product and the rest it borrows. And then it of course regulates and taxes all of the rest. So it's very much of a socialist country rather than a capitalist one, but there we are. Katherine talked about people not being able to live on social benefits. Well, there you go. Who's in charge of social benefits? It's part of the welfare state. It's not part of it. It's not exactly a capitalist situation. Of course, it is partly capitalist because it's only capitalism which produces the wealth, that produces the taxes, that produces the welfare system that we've got. And you can argue we should have more. You can argue that we've got less, but it's not. You can't blame capitalism because the welfare state doesn't work. Katherine also mentioned food banks. Most of the people who access food banks, well, firstly, food banks are a perfectly sensible, independent, charitable response to a failing welfare system, because most of the people who use food banks are being let down by the welfare state. They're being let down by social benefit because the department of whatever it is hasn't, worked out their eligibility, and they have to wait 3 weeks in order to get their benefits. That's why you have things like food banks, and most people who use food banks use them only once or twice. Look, we're talking about vulnerable groups here. Now, who are the most vulnerable groups? Well, I'll tell you who the most vulnerable group are, and that is the people around the planet who have to live on $1 a day in $1 poverty. And when I was born, and for most of my time when I was a student at St Andrews, 4/5 of the world population lived in $1 a day poverty. Now, that is a tiny, tiny fraction of people, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we had 70 years of socialism, and the Soviet Union seeding governments in Africa and so on, the communist governments, did absolutely no good at all. The thing that's made a change is since 1991, the world has opened up to trade and competition. India came in and China came in and so on. That is what's made the difference. That is what has raised people out of $1 a day poverty. And I think in the last 30 years we've probably raised about 1 billion people out of $1 a day poverty. And that's trade, competition, that's capitalism for you. And it's interesting, that the free countries and the capitalist countries are actually the most equal, because your advancement doesn't depend on whether you're a member of the party or whether you happen to be the right race or you happen to be the right religion or you happen to be the right family. But okay, what about the poor here at home? As I say, capitalism generates the wealth that you need to run a welfare state. We all want to make sure that people don't live in abject poverty, of course. And therefore we pay taxes for that reason. And capitalism similarly generates the wealth that can be used in philanthropy. You get people like Dylan and Miranda Gates giving away their entire fortune to solve malaria and various other problems. And that's a capitalist solution. It generates wealth for social entrepreneurship. Americans give twice as much to charity as we do in this country because they're not taxed as much, because it's a more competitive country, because it's a more capitalist country, because people then grow richer and they can afford to give more money where it's needed. And they're better at doing it than the government is. And remember also that capitalism produces, we're talking here about choice and competition, that produces lots of goods which are better and cheaper. It's not a state monopoly. People are vying to sell their goods to the public, and they have to keep on improving them and making them cheaper and better. And of course that is extremely good for low-income people. So again, we have more smartphones on this planet than we do people. And even in some of the poorest parts of the world, people have got smartphones, and that empowers them because they can check the prices of their crops on the world markets, and they can say to the local dealers, well, you're not paying me enough. This is hugely liberating, and it didn't come from government, it came from capitalism. And capitalism promotes job creation, it gives people an opportunity to rise and improve themselves. Well, what about, sick and elderly, another vulnerable group? Well, of course, it was private companies that developed the COVID vaccines for a start. I mean, the Russian and Chinese government had a go, but theirs don't work. Medical research is largely driven by private enterprise, or saving for old age. You know, again, it's capitalism that produces the wealth that people can invest so that they can look after themselves in old age. And a quarter of the elderly population of the UK are actually millionaires, believe it or not. Well, they didn't get that from the state pension, they got it from saving themselves. And, you know, I could go on. What about religious and ethnic groups? I went to Hyderabad recently, and it's amazing. Right in the middle of Africa, used to be an extremely poor place. Now it's got a huge IT industry, and it has broken down caste divisions because people want brains, right? They don't want somebody just because they happen to be a member of a particular caste. So capitalism is breaking down all of these old divisions. So, in conclusion, I would say that capitalism does actually deliver. It delivers consumer choice, which means people get affordable products. That's good for the poor. Philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, these are products of capitalism. It produces tax revenues for state services and support. Technological advances, like communications and healthcare, delivery of healthcare, and economic mobility. It gives people a pathway up and out of poverty. And it creates jobs which create income, which create opportunity, and people aren't stuck as they would be under socialism. So I think that capitalism undoubtedly is exceedingly good for vulnerable groups. Thank you very much.
I'd like to speak for the excellent address, and I'd pass the floor to the final position speaker to continue the case for the positive research ahead.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much, Eamonn, for really a brilliant perspective on why capitalism is good. And I like the fact that you noted that it helps us to provide or produce better goods at a cheaper cost. And so I will be speaking in support of my motion, which is this House believes that capitalism has failed vulnerable people within the context of the foreign investment of processing and exporting of fish meal and fish oil from West Africa. The realities and the pictures that was painted by Eamonn is, of course, that capitalism have resulted in lifting millions of people, even billions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, as he noted, from poverty. And I hope that by the end of my presentation, you can make your decision as to whether this is actually the fact or not. If we lose command of the sea, it is not invasion we must fear, but starvation. This is a quote that is credited to Admiral John Fisher in 1904 in relation to the war in Britain. But today I paraphrase this quote to sort of help you understand the picture of a reality that millions of people, even billions at the global level, face due to the impact of depleting fish stock that is exacerbated by either oil pollution, the impact of climate change, overfishing, including illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, which is driven by capitalist ideology of the quest for profit and demand for certain species, which is driving people to catch the rest at whatever cost that they would want to. I would focus my discussion, or I could focus my conversation on this, the evidence I'm going to provide to you on the impact of the historical activities of multinational oil companies in Nigeria's Niger Delta, where I'm from, on the environment and the resultant degradation that have resulted in the degradation or depletion of mangrove vegetation. I could do that, but I will not, because obviously capitalism have really helped people in the Niger Delta to come out of poverty. They absolutely enjoy and benefit from Shell and ExxonMobil and other oil companies that have been degrading their lands. I could also focus my discussion on the activity of multinational company Transfigura, who in 2006 would rather dispose of toxic waste in Cote d'Ivoire without disclosing the real content, rather than pay €500,000 to dispose of it ethically in a European company. This toxic dumping of waste resulted in the death of over 15 people and the hospitalization of more than 100,000 people. And today in the Brielle Lagoon area, the impact is somehow still felt. But I will not. I'm focusing, of course, on the impact of fish meal industries or fish meal factories operating in the Gambia, Mauritania, and Senegal, and how it is pushing people that rely on fisheries for their livelihood into poverty. The men, artisanal fishermen that fish, and the women that process and trade this fish, and more or less push further into poverty because of the competition to supply the fish meal industries. I will talk about the impact of this by focusing on 5 different points. First, the income inequality that this brings. Capitalism perpetuates income inequality such that the Asian companies and European companies, foreign companies that own or operate this fish meal industry in Senegal, Mauritania, and the Gambia, primarily from China or Turkey, have literally prized women that would usually process the fish out of the market because the suppliers would rather supply the fish industries than the women. This has also contributed to almost depletion of round Sardinella species, which is a common species staple food in these countries, undermining their food security, undermining their economic security. But of course, this is fine because it allows companies and entities in Europe that sell farmed fish to be able to make the promise of sustainability because, well, it is fish meal, it is contributing to our culture, and therefore it doesn't necessarily harm anyone. You're taking fish or stealing fish from human to feed fish to be able to sell to human. It's not necessarily a problem because as we have heard, people are benefiting from it, people are getting jobs from it, and people are also sort of supported out of poverty as a result of it. It has also resulted in environmental degradation, and I would like to focus on this point by sharing an excerpt by a journalist who, in a podcast conversation about the impact of fish meal industry in the Gambia, in trying to describe the impact of pollution from the fish meal industries, he said to me that the impact is such that the ocean that once cured his rash now gave him rash. And so this is for you to sort of understand the fact that a lot of these industries are also disposing of their waste directly into the oceans because, well, it is cheaper. They want to be able to maximize their profit and hopefully employ more Gambians and obviously help them out of poverty. This is the kind of thing that capitalism can support us to do. And finally, I'd like to focus on the impact, because I don't know how much time that I have, but I'd like to focus on the impact on social disruptions. The profit-driven nature of fish meal industries disrupt local societies and traditional way of life or ways of life, affecting the social fabrics of vulnerable communities such as those in the Gambia, Senegal, and Mauritania, and leaving them more exposed to poverty and social issues. Specifically, the depletion of fish stock, which is exacerbated by different factors, but particularly overfishing, to be able to service this fish meal and fish oil industry, have impacted significantly the livelihoods of local communities, particularly men who once relied on fishing. In response, some of these individuals have resorted to regular migration by the Mediterranean routes, risking their lives, and you might have seen some of them on TV, risking their lives to reach Europe in pursuit of a better life. Unfortunately, many of them, or many of these migrants, do not survive a dangerous journey. For those who are fortunate to survive or to reach their destination, such as the island of Lampedusa or somewhere in Malta or Greece, they often face detention and eventually deportation. This situation highlights a paradox. Europe would rather take their fish, but would not be interested in allowing them in. In summary, whilst I believe that capitalism has some economic benefit in that it might have contributed to an extent to the economic development of certain countries. I hope that I have been I've been able to at least convince you to an extent with the evidence that I've provided. That capitalism is absolutely detrimental to a very large extent based on the evidence that I've presented to the lives of vulnerable communities, especially those in coastal and small island developing states. Thank you so much.
Final opportunity to be on the stretch ahead.
Sorry, just let me get my timer on so I don't bore you to tears. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Sorry, you were expecting my organisation's executive chair, but he couldn't make it, so you're stuck with me instead. My apologies. I think to start with, I just wish to re-emphasise that, of course, capitalism has not always been perfect and delivered perfect outcomes in every circumstance, but overall, on balance, it has done more to help vulnerable groups improve their lives than any other system that humanity has yet devised. Three things I sort of want to do in this speech. First, I just want to respond to some of the excellent points made by the proposition. Secondly, I wish to sort of talk a bit more and expand a bit more on Eamonn's point about how it's really made a huge difference to hundreds of millions of people in the developing world, particularly in sort of South and East Asia. And thirdly, to talk about how it has benefited the innovations that capitalism allows, target specific vulnerable groups, particularly sort of those with disabilities or health needs or etc. First, I just want to, both set of speakers have talked about the negatives of capitalism. We've heard that people are struggling on universal credit, and again, I just would to reiterate a point. I mean, part of the only reason we can afford, and obviously, it's unacceptable that number of people are living in those circumstances, and no one wants to play down what those people are going through. But it's only a capitalist system, it's only the wealth generated from that capitalist system that makes it possible to afford anything like the welfare state that we have today. And even some of the issues, of course not all of them, but some of the issues mentioned, particularly to do with housing, are actually caused by a lack of capitalism, not an excess of it. A lot of the planning for the reason housing is so expensive is because the government restricts the supply of land upon which one can build. If you restrict the supply of land and the same number of people are chasing the houses, of course you're going to create a shortage and shove up prices. We also restrict and control how much the local authorities are made to spend if they wish to acquire land to build housing. They have to pay an artificially high value. These are government interventions that could be removed to make a real difference. But also on the environmental front, and again, I was fascinated to hear about what sort of happened in Africa, and it's horrific that organisations have been able to exploit in communities in that fashion, and sadly not too surprising. But I just sort of, again, at risk of sort of perhaps out-defining the debate, part of the issue is it's one of regulation. Capitalism exists in a regulated market. Even sort of the most stringent, it's a matter of, rather than saying that capitalism is necessarily the problem, it's to do with the companies, the countries that are basic, on which these multinational companies are based, to better regulate. Even sort of the most free market thinker would think it's reasonable to regulate against negative externalities, and definitely mistreating people and abusing resources and wiping out natural resources is clearly a classic example of a negative externality. And sort of to move on sort of my slightly more points and sort of move on to my own points, I just want to also reiterate the role that capitalism has played in lifting people out of extreme poverty, and particularly with two sort of case studies in mind. I mean, China and India. China, post-1949, as one well knows, pursued a radical Marxist economic policy, and as a result, under Chairman Mao and his early successors. But so that by 1980, 90% of the population was living in extreme poverty. It was only when the power of the market was unleashed, people were able to own their own enterprises. people were able to compete against, to some extent, inefficient state firms, that you saw the most dramatic example of poverty reduction in history. So the rate of absolute poverty fell from 90% to 0. It's also worth noting that once the government, more recently under President Xi, has decided to retreat from a more capitalist framework towards one which he, as sort of leader of the state, decides to exercise, tries to micromanage and control what free enterprise can do, that China's economic growth rate has stalled and has still never recovered from the period of COVID. And similarly with India as well. For the first 45 years after independence, it pursued a very much a socialist economic policy. It rejected outside investment. It restricted what companies could produce and where. It was only when those restrictions were lifted that sort of the economic growth took off. And again, it's also partly a balancing exercise. Even if one accepts, and there is reason to accept there have been some negative consequences to capital, to the development of capitalism. We certainly saw that in this country during the Industrial Revolution. When one looks at the sheer numbers, the hundreds of millions of people who have been lifted out of poverty, when you consider that the problems that do exist can to a significant extent be addressed by better regulation, when you consider that and you consider the enormous benefits that capitalism has played, it's very hard not to argue that, to recognize that capitalism has helped the most vulnerable groups, and particularly when you consider that, as Eamonn pointed out, the most vulnerable groups among those are the people who are stuck on only stuck on $1 a day or less. So for that reason, if nothing else, I think that we definitely owe a few cheers to capitalism. But let me also, and again, let me then move on to sort of my final point, which is the role that innovation plays, because we've talked a lot about how capitalism can help those on lower incomes, but let's talk a bit about those from other groups. For reasons we've already mentioned, the existence of the profit motive, the ability for me to start up a company and borrow some money and to explore ideas that may be original or maybe particular interest, or to identify a gap in the market. Capitalism provides an unprecedented degree of, an unrivaled degree of innovation. This is particularly important not just because, I can use a smartphone and make sure I don't ramble on for more than the prescribed time, but also that you can tackle the very specific needs of very specific groups. So, to cite a personal example, when my mother was terminally ill with motor neurone disease and couldn't speak, the fact that someone was able to develop a device called an eye gaze that meant that she could send messages purely with the power of her eyes, and she was able to improve her quality of life dramatically in those sort of final days, was a really powerful thing. And that's just one example. But whether it be, someone deciding to specialize on software that allows that sort of allows people to speak into a computer because their eyesight's poor, or to have cochlear implants so that their hearing is restored. The ability of capitalism to help those with disabilities and other vulnerabilities certainly makes a huge difference. But also, it's the innovations that help connect different communities together. We talk about vulnerable communities. It might be, for example, someone from the LGBT community in a society in which that is, it is very much an underground factor. The fact that almost everyone these days has access to cheap smartphones and the ability to install, apps and is able to reach out to people in their community and even sort of connect through moral fashion means like sort of previously websites or whatever. So it means that people are able to come together and find themselves, or even members of sort of ethnic communities or members of smaller minority groups are able to link to each other in a way that would not otherwise be possible, and there's a reason that innovation hasn't occurred anywhere outside the capital as well. So before I go on, so proud to support capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you to the press, and thank you to all speakers for what has been a fantastic debate so far. It's now time to open the debate up to the floor. To catch the chair's eye, please raise your hand. Speeches will be up to 2 minutes in length, and I don't have a gavel, so I will knock on the table until time has expired. Are there any speeches from the floor to begin? Oh my god, I can't see. Jack. Oh, say your name for the minutes, but also project your voice. The camera is on the top gallery, so.
Okay, well, Jack. So the opposition stand up and make a very good case, but if any of you react with skepticism but don't know why, it's because there's a fundamental contradiction in what they say. On the one hand, they talk about whole society systems, capitalist success against socialist failure, how socialism failed in Eastern Europe, which you'll hear no arguments from me about, but also how capitalism succeeds in creating COVID vaccines, of raising people out of poverty, even if one example given is the state-run economy of China, or of creating new technology. Yet on the other hand, they also talk about how our countries are not purely capitalist, but part capitalist, part socialist, including apparently the UK. By doing this, they then try to disavow the failures of countries like the US and the UK to the homeless, the poor, as failures of socialism, as failures of socialist countries, right? But guess what? Those are the same countries that produce those COVID vaccines, that develop that technology, right? With all this confusion, I'm not actually entirely sure what is capitalism and what isn't. But I'm minded to believe what they said first, that we don't live under a fully capitalist system. And I think that that's a good thing. The happiest countries in the world pay a largest percentage of tax, have a large, well-established welfare state, and large governments. So according to the definition provided, these are the least capitalist states. And I speak, of course, of the Nordic states. So maybe the capitalist system has been a good one, but using that to justify the reduction of regulation of the welfare state, of more capitalism being good in every case, isn't right and doesn't add up.
Any other speeches from the floor? Yes, state your name for the minutes, please.
Hello, my name is Juan. It's easy to sing the praises of the capitalist system and all that it has provided when you're sitting in the United Kingdom, a country who has benefited throughout its entire history from a massive and gigantic import of goods and production from other countries which it put into force and submitted through its colonial empire. It's easy to sing the praises of a giant industrial revolution that led to massive profits and massive development of the poor in the UK when it was off of the suffering of the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa, of parts of Asia, of South America, who do not have that privilege to live in an economy where everybody can afford to have an iPhone or any kind of smartphone, because they cannot. Because the state will not fund it, because the state does not have the resources to fund it, because those resources are no longer in that continent. They're in another continent. Why do we sing the praises of the development of capitalism in Europe and America when it only began the moment that colonialism allowed it? When the submission of other states through force gave it the resources to produce that development.
Speech. Any other speeches from the floor? Yes, state your name for the minutes.
I'm Clara. There's sort of two things I want to say. The first is more just an observational thing, and it's not Jack's, but it's in a similar sort of aesthetic line as Jack's observation, which is that the opposition bench appears to be saying that capitalism has done fantastic things in increasing the wealth that is available to people. But that seems an internal tension, because you're using capitalism to justify why capitalism is good, i.e. you're increasing the amount of wealth that people have through capitalism, but given that wealth is an innate part of capitalism, I don't believe that to be an innate good of it when it's the own thing that it's created. Using the example of the first opposition speaker, when he stands and he says that this farmer now has mobile phones so they can access the stock market and somehow see that their crops are not selling for as much here as they would on the stock market, so they can go to the person and advocate for higher prices. First of all, I just don't think that's how it works anyway. But second of all, I think that in itself is an observational difficulty for me, because you're just saying that this individual who functions in capitalism is being screwed over, less screwed over because of a different part of capitalism that they can now access. So I think that I need opposition, rather than just flagging socialist failures as an example of why capitalism is good, to explain to me why capitalism in and of itself is good. Because the second thing that I want to say, and I'll do it briefly, Path, is that the thing that capitalism does is that it creates a mindset, and they use it to justify innovation, but the thing that it actually does is it encourages people to think that wealth is always going to be increasing. And the reality is that wealth and resources are finite and cannot continue to increase. This is why redistribution is such an important thing for people to focus on, because redistribution of resources is necessary when we function in a world that doesn't have ever-increasing energy sources. So maybe capitalism has gotten us to a good place, but redistribution is the only solution to a current world with finite resources.
Floor speech. Any other speeches from the floor? Yes, the one at the very back there.
I would like to make still review of the position of the opposition. I will start with the first one. I think that both sides try to clarify the semantics of what capitalism is. I don't think they try to particularly clarify on the semantics of what a vulnerable group is. As a working definition, I would like to state that a vulnerable group is simply a group which compromises a minority. And in this case, I would like to argue that capitalism does not necessarily help those groups. A COVID vaccine example was given. Sure, it's very beneficial to the majority of the people, people who will the coronavirus. But at the same time, multiple rare types of cancer remain without the proper resources devoted to the research of how to cure it, because a large part of the system we live at the moment is capitalistic. That means that people have the right to spend their capital, and people who possess the capital prefer to spend it not on the charitable cause of curing rare forms of cancer, for example, but instead on spending it on recreation, supposedly, let's say, yachts. And that means that capitalism innately, in my opinion, damages groups which are specified to be vulnerable, in my opinion. That's first rebuttal. Second rebuttal is that there was a statement from the opposition that capitalism is the best known system for the creation of wealth. I have to state that I have only limited economical background, but to my awareness, there are successful modern historical precedents of capital being created specifically by non-capitalistic means. One of the examples is South Korea, where they specifically were able to industrialize successfully by the extensive government control, regulation of trade markets, and elimination of competition by monopolies which were introduced and totally supported by the state. There are other examples. There are examples which relate to the control of natural resources in Africa, if I'm aware, and of the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, sorry, can you say your name for the minutes, please?
Pardon?
Your name for the minutes, please. Your name.
Grigori Klimenko.
I thank the member for their floor speech. Any other speeches from the floor? Yes, please say your name for the minutes.
I'm Matt. I think there was one very important subject not discussed here, that in this elsewhere, the wealth is a good thing, and not have wealth is a bad thing. However, it doesn't seem like wealth is the only thing that we should have in our life. We are not this type of money. There are some other essential property that made us as a human. And this wealth is, as those say, the capitalism generate wealth. But if we look on the ground picture, our life not just consists of wealth. There should be some other things such as life, election, family, other things to consider. And capitalism, it seems, doesn't really accommodate them very well. So I think can't just assume that you think that wealth is a good thing, capitalism generate wealth, so we can go in that direction. There's something more to discuss on this aspect that why should we have wealth? Maybe we should have something else. Therefore, I just think this discussion is constructive. Thank you.
Other members of the floor speech, any other speeches from the floor? Oh, they said their name. Is it Matt?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, thanks.
Yes, so minutes.
Hello, I'm Alistair. I'm going to repeat their trend of saying, I think that the best thing is a combination of capitalism and other things. I think social democracy is good, and it's therefore messy to determine what the actual votes in this debate is. I just wanted to add one positive, addition to, extension of what Jack said, and as a push to opt, but also wanted to push a bit on what some previous speakers. Not on the point about the role of the state. I think it's not just there to regulate. I think in your examples of things like drugs and things like technology like the iPhone or smartphones, we often just see that actually, for example, having a state that does a large amount of investment is a good power, especially in tandem with the market. Like the COVID vaccine maybe was created by Pfizer, but it was backed by the US government, guaranteeing that they would buy huge amounts of it even if it was a failure. And there's also true of the smartphone, huge amounts of the technology that was inside it came from DoD and development that had happened in America, where like, the military just funds a shit ton of research, because usually capitalist countries don't actually want to do extremely risky, high level and early stage research. They usually want to apply more abstract research, which is often done by the state or by academia, etc. They're not just push to the op. So I think that there is a lot of exploitation in capitalism, a lot of greed, you know, relation of previous colonialism or modern exploitation. But I do echo the sentiment that this is not unique to capitalism. It seems like something that we have to, as society, restrain in all systems and have a solution to, i.e. we've seen under feudalism or under the communism of the Soviet Union, that things like imperialism, the exploitation of resources of other nations, is not unique to capitalist companies or to capitalist systems. I think that, like, generally there are a lot of moral principles that our society should value. If we have one end, like profit, we're probably not going to, you know, properly value them. But it's also not clear to me that, like, there's any, you know, macro level sense beyond maybe just social democracy way to avoid these things occurring in all societies, regardless of their exact economic system.
Any other speeches on the floor? Yes.
Name's Oscar. I wanted to talk about social mobility and innovation as well. I think a lot of people like to think that capitalism has been the only real source of innovation and social mobility in terms of these things, but for most anyway. But countries like Mongolia during the Soviet times enabled a largely very rural nomadic lifestyle of people to increase to a literacy rate of 94%, using basically no resources and only working under a communist system. And this, I think, can be extended to other things where, as many people know, the first people in space were not Americans, they were Russian. And a lot of the technological advancements, especially because it's under the military in the Cold War, were done by the Soviets, which didn't have a capitalist system. So, to extend this, I think the ability where a largely poverty-stricken family is able to get free education and some sort of state, you know, albeit with political persecution and whatnot, where they're able to get some sort of food on the table and some sort of education in them, I think is a better system than some sort of, you know, top-down autocratic society they lived in before, which was probably akin to, you know, some sort of monarchy where they didn't have any sort of thing and had to work on their own farm to get any sort of food and had no education. So I think in terms of that, it was the great leveler in terms of social mobility, is what communism did in that period, which I think should be noted for both sides. Thanks.
One member for the floor speech. Any of the speeches on the floor? Yes.
William, this will be surprising for a young person, but I'm going to defend capitalism in 4 ways. First way to defend it is just the equality of an individual that no other system can provide. All that capitalism tells you is that your labor is your own and you can do with it what you want. The reason I think this is good for vulnerable individuals is because it is just the fundamental empowerment of an individual of their own right. I think this does two things. To answer Kara's question, what money provides you is privacy, being able to do and get whatever you want from a system and not dependent upon a government or a state to provide it for you. This is the only thing that capitalism can do, and it's the only thing that no other system cannot do. As in, no other system can provide you the individuality and the privacy to do what you want. I think this fundamentally results in a fourth premise, which is meritocracy. There is no other system that can exist outside of capitalism that rewards you for what you should do or what you are as a person. I think therefore this is the best for vulnerable groups because, as we've already heard from opposition, it divorces you of social characteristics like race or gender and empowers you as an individual actor of your own right. I think this is why fundamentally, not democracy, because I don't like democracy, what am I arguing for? Capitalism is fundamentally empowering the vulnerable groups. Defense of capitalism. There you go, Carl.
Members for their floor speech. Any other speeches on the floor? Yes, we'll go there.
So first of all, I would like to thank everyone for this vote and both the opposition and the opposition for their audience. But I would like to focus on one point. The opposition bench has talked a lot about abstract benefits of capitalism, such as innovation. But I think they have debated a little bit the question of whether capitalism has benefited marginalized groups, or whether it has failed them. And I think we can actually look back to history of how capitalism was founded in order to answer this question. So how were the initial resources needed to kickstart capitalism acquired? Well, if we look back to history, we can see an extremely bloody and devastating history of European colonialism. We can see entire nations in the Americas, in the New World, being almost completely eradicated by the European colonizers. And then we can see European colonizers, in order to exploit the land that they have stolen, start the institution of the transatlantic slave trade, and basically enslave massive numbers of people from the continent of Africa and ship them systemically to the Americas in order to make them work for basically no wages, no food, no resources. So we can see that capitalism was founded using the systemic dispossession of the most vulnerable groups in society. Now, my second point is the opposition have said that that was a good point, that we should not compare theory and praxis. I completely agree with this, so instead I propose that we look at history again for a case study of a country that has survived both socialism and capitalism. And that happens to be my home country, it's Russia, and the other countries of the post-Soviet Union. So we can see that when capitalism was established, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, this resulted in the greatest decline of GDP since the Second World War in this region. We can see that this resulted in a tremendous increase of poverty, the collapse of wages, and almost complete destruction of heavy industry and science and innovation in this region. Thank you.
Just give your name for the minutes, please. Sorry.
Georgie.
Georgie. Right, any other speeches on the floor? Yes.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I guess one of the problems that I have with capitalism in practice and less so in theory is that in theory it assumes that you are paid accordingly to your efforts and to your labour, but it doesn't happen in practice. The industry of care is deeply undervalued, and there's a focus on profits and wealth that completely devalues kind of feminist systems of care, but also looking after each other and friendships and things like that. This kind of affects people across the whole capitalist system. Even if you think about like finance workers in London, they're working over 100 hours a week and not seeing their friends and family in search of profit and money instead of actually focusing on other things that matter outside of them, such as family, friendships, things that you can't ascribe monetary value to. And so I think that's just kind of one of the main issues that I have with capitalism is that, you know, under capitalism, we are seeing nurses go on strike because they are not being paid enough. We are seeing mothers for years not being paid for their unpaid labour within the household. And this has historically affected women, but now it's affecting anyone who wants to kind of look after other people. So that's kind of, yeah.
The final floor speech, any other speeches on the floor? Yes, let's do it in 2 minutes.
So I'd just like to respond to William's speech and just clear the air a little bit around this debate as a whole. So first of all, I think we all get very used to making arguments as though we're living on a crowded planet, because we are. But let's just wind it back a little bit. If I'm a single person living in a country entirely on my own, then what work I put in is what I get out. My mobility within society is completely determined by what I do and how I think and how I interact with the environment, not with other people. Add a few more people into the mix, then your mobility, your creativity is determined by yourself, yes, but by your relationships with people. That determines what you can do. It's not about money, it's about what you put into your small society. And I think, you know, we still see things that operate in the same way. Take competitive debating for an example. It's not about what money you have, it's about literally what work you put in, what your work ethic is, the relationships that you have, which determines how you move through society. So I think the way capitalism has sprung up is really just in response to there being so many people overwhelming natural resources such that each individual person can no longer operate independently in the world. And so my push then is to proposition, to argue, well, really it's all well and good to complain, but what can you propose? What solution do you have as an alternative to capitalism that can allow us to access that same degree of mobility in a crowded planet? Given that now, in response to another floor speech, that people are now trying to gain the money to be able to live in a way where they make their own food and they live their own life independently. People ask right before that, it's not an unpleasant thing, it's what people would like to get back to. How are we going to achieve that? Thank you.
The floor speech, any other speeches from the floor? Time maybe like 2 or 3. Yes, state your name for the minutes.
Mara Master. I want to commend the opposition for bringing up the example of philanthropy, because of course there have been a lot of good examples of like, huge philanthropy from like big billionaires like Bill and Melinda Gates. Charles Meany recently just passed away. But of course there are a lot of bad examples to like where that can go when capitalism is left unhinged. And I would also like to argue that like philanthropy is not inherently capitalist, and like when it is capitalist, then it's working to like sort of repair like the problems that repair problems that capitalist systems have created. And I don't think many would argue that the thing vulnerable communities is a goal of capitalism, that it is like in the way that it is a goal of the welfare state. So definitely can't deny the good that huge philanthropic donations have done from believers in the capitalist system. But I don't think that the example of philanthropy is something that makes capitalism look favorable.
In this hall, what was your name again?
Morrow Master Pasqua.
Morrow.
It's like tomorrow. So I could add the 2.
You can grab it in. Great. Speeches from the floor? Yes.
So I think it's important to bring up that we seem to be treating this conversation as if there's like a linear as if there's like a divide between just capitalism and socialism and communism, controlled by where like resources are controlled and distributed by the state. And I think it's important to consider that there have been a lot of proposed systems which are not capitalist but vary from the model of socialism that has actually been put into practice in the Soviet Union and wherever. Namely, I'm thinking about syndicalism, where a risk of like not having enough time to explain the whole thing. The workers own their means of production, their business as a syndicate, and they elect the leaders to that business internally. There's no outside control, and those syndicates compete with each other within a free market. So I think that's very important to consider, because the competitive aspect of capitalism, which seems to be what the defense of capitalism largely rests on, is preserved, whereas while resources are still more evenly distributed throughout society, and that I think is it changes the debate a lot to consider alternatives other than just socialism.
Any final speeches from the floor? You're back. State your name for minutes.
Flynn. So we've heard a lot about how capitalism can impact the environment. I think that's a very important thing to consider. But I would argue that other systems, such as communism, have actually historically done far greater damage to the environment, because they have the ability to mobilize, the entire state to damage the environment. And as 2 examples I just cite, Mao's 2 5-year plans, which are probably the biggest deforestation events in human history, and could probably be forever. And then also the USSR's draining of the Aral Sea, which completely wiped out an entire, not just communities, but entire societies rooted around fishing, in a way that probably is comparable to the exploits of multinational corporations. And then also slightly worried by the sort of Malthusian arguments we've heard 3 or 4 times from floor speeches, and the idea that there's somehow limited resources, limited technologies, and we therefore need to redistribute. And I just say that historically this is not true. For example, now we have more oil reserves than we've ever had at any point that we know of in history. In fact, oil reserves are growing faster than oil usage is growing, and they have been pretty much since we first struck oil. And as a final point, I'd like to push back against the floor speech that somehow suggested that the collapse of the USSR was the biggest drop in the GDP growth of Russia ever. And I'd like to say that that's just because the USSR fundamentally was exploiting the resources of so many other countries to prop up Russia for its elite. Thank you.
Remember for their fine speech. Thank you for all the 4 speeches so far. I won't take Friday's thunder again like it was week 0, but conversations can be done later as announced. Great, so it's now time to bring the debate back to the dispatch boxes. We don't have them either. Gavin gone as well. So we bring back the lectern, let's say. Each bench has a total of 10 minutes to give their reply, which can be split equally, or one speaker may give the entire reply. With that being said, we'll go in the opposite direction, so I give a call to the opposition bench first to give their reply. Here.
Thank you very much. I was very appreciative of the many speeches from the floor, even though some of them did seem to be written by artificial intelligence, because they obviously lack the real thing. There's a couple of points which came out which I do want to pick up. One was Clara? Clara. Her point that wealth is finite. No, it isn't. The whole point of capitalism is to create wealth. Wealth is something you create. If you do nothing, then you won't have wealth, you'll have poverty. You've got to do stuff to get yourself out of poverty. You've got to do stuff to create wealth. And that is capitalism. You need markets and competition, and you need enterprise. And that's the basis of capitalism. So I thought Matt was absolutely right that we need wealth creation. Let's have more of it. And where we've got problems is we're not creating enough wealth. Remember also that capitalist countries are the most economically equal. There's no surprise in that. Capitalism comes out of liberalism, liberal thinking. 17th century liberal ideas led to the 18th century boom in economics in the 19th century, the free trade era. Because you have to have liberal values first. You have to have a society in which people can do their own thing, in which everybody can have a shot and improve their own lives and the lives of their families. And it's only then that you can actually build the institutions of capitalism and markets and trade and competition and commerce. So that is why capitalism is good for vulnerable groups, because it doesn't discriminate. It costs you money to discriminate. A good capitalist doesn't do that. If a shopkeeper wouldn't serve people of a particular ethnic background, for example, they would lose money. So they don't do it. Or if they wanted to only employ people of a certain ethnic background, they wouldn't have the choice of employees. So they don't do it. So capitalism breaks down discrimination. And we've seen that over and over again. And many socialist government-run governments are rife with discrimination against minorities and ethnic groups and all the rest of it. That's not a prominent feature of capitalism. I'd like also to take up the environment thing, which several people mentioned, and if it as well, of course. Environmental exploitation, yes, of course it goes on, there's no question about that. But which are the cleanest countries? The cleanest countries are the richest ones. because they're concerned about the environment. They're concerned about cleaning things up. You go to poor countries and you see litter everywhere and plastic bottles gumming up the rivers and all the rest of it, because they've got other things to worry about, like getting food on the table, looking after their families. They're not worried that much about the environment. And you've got China saying, well, you guys, you grew with coal and polluting the atmosphere. Well, why can't we do the same? But when you get wealth, you look around and you say, well, I want better healthcare. I want better environment. I want people to live without coughing and wheezing, and not to get poisoned water. That's the sort of society that a rich community wants to live in. So capitalism is very positive in terms of environmental protection. Remember who it was that poisoned half of Europe with Chernobyl. It wasn't a capitalist enterprise, it was a socialist one. There was a point made about philanthropy. No, I think this is fundamental. Capitalism isn't sort of something that's anti-human. Capitalism is about liberating human attitudes and sensibilities. And people do want to help others. It's part of our nature. And if we're wealthy, we can do more, right? And it's not just Bill Gates, it's just everybody who has a little bit of spare cash or a little bit of spare time. They can go and help in the community. My brother is retired, and he spends his time working for a charitable healthcare organisation. That you can do in capitalism because you've got the wealth to do it. You're not dead by the age of 55. So I think we came here, Will and I, in order to not to win the debate. We didn't expect to do that, but to win the argument. And I think we have won the argument because we've talked about how capitalism delivers choice and affordable products for the poorest people, how it promotes philanthropy, how it provides tax revenues for those collective decisions that we want to make, like supporting the poorest. It provides a pathway up out of poverty for people, economic opportunity, job creation, and all the rest of it. And what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to do all these things through politics. And politics is another word which is very easy to define. It's got two bits to it. One is poly, meaning a lot of, and ticks, which are nasty little bloodsuckers. So, let's hear it for capitalism. It does actually benefit vulnerable groups to an extent that alternatives just historically have never done. Thank you.
You have 4 minutes left for reply. Would you like to continue your time, or would you like to? Okay.
Oh, no, sorry, no.
Yeah. I'm welcome the second opposition speaker to continue the reply.
I just wanted to expand on a couple of points that were raised. First, this idea that capitalism is entirely predicated, and I know this is a rational argument, predicated on slavery and oppression, and therefore, its benefits, are silent by. Slavery was a tragic feature of human history, but it was a fairly universal feature of human history. It was really only like the British capitalist system and the British capitalist state, and it was really only that sort of innovation that enabled Britain to grow. To say that slavery was the reason that capitalism occurred, it simply is not true, because otherwise capitalism occurred in multiple societies where slavery existed. I also just wanted to expand a little bit about this idea of innovation, and that innovation is possible in non-capitalist societies. Yes, it is true the Soviet Union put the first man into space, but this this is one short-term advantage of a top-down dictatorial system. You can direct all the resources into one place. But here's the problem. You direct all the resources in the one place, whether it's the right idea or not. You might be able to achieve a temporary dominance in one particular domain, but then you end up stagnating in every other domain. The Soviet Union had a very advanced space program for a few years, until the Americans, with far greater capital and far greater know-how, and the ability to tap into the private sector as well, surpassed them. Meanwhile, the rest of Soviet society languished and suffered. And it's, And again, if we want to talk about sort of how capitalist transitions can be traumatic, yes, what happened in the Soviet Union after the collapse of communism was horrific. But again, that's partly because one, the Soviet system was inherently unsustainable, and was, you can see what happens with other societies that didn't go down the free market path, or the few that exist, like the North Koreas, which have just stagnated and become worse and worse and worse, which is probably more of an indication of where Russia would have ended up had it not gone down the capitalist. Certainly not gone down the capitalist, not gone down the capitalist path. And I also finally sort of want to touch on the countries that several have been mentioned, sort of the South Koreas, the Chinas. Yes, they do contain a degree of state involvement, but here's the thing that distinguished them from their neighbours in the case of South Korea, or their past in the case of China. It was when these societies allowed, in China's case, allowed market forces to assume a far greater role than they had done, that the economy was able to grow, and it wasn't at the whim of some authoritarian regime. Or in South Korea's case, yes, there was a degree of state direction, but who owned most of the economy? It was the chaebols. It was the large private firms. It essentially created the sort of the free market economy that sort of allowed South Korea to be one of the very few countries to have escaped developing world status. Not a single non-capitalist country has managed to do so. So I don't really think there's a whole lot more that I can add. Although I would sort of stress again that the role that capitalism has played in sort of bringing different groups, the innovation and the way that can bring different groups together who would otherwise be missed. But having not expected to speak and having nothing really more to say, I'm once again very happy to defend capitalism.
It's now time to cross the floor and give you call to the opposition speaker to start their reply. Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all the excellent contributions from the floor. I want to go back on a couple of points raised by the opposition benches. You said that food bank usage was caused by the universal credit delay. That is actually not the case. There is a delay in getting universal credit, and by the time you get it, you're actually in debt to the DWP, so that is unhelpful. But it's actually because Social Security has basically long been disconnected from this idea of contribution and adequacy. And you're talking about capitalism and being a good thing, getting people into wealthy jobs, and I've agreed. We do need to get people into well-paid jobs, but we need to give people a safety net, and we need to give them a trampoline back. Because even if you do advocate for capitalism, you need to ensure people are well enough to work. You need to ensure that people can get into work. One of the other reasons that people depend on food banks now is because of the sanction regime. And if you're asking people to look for work, to put them under distress and put them in their and basically damage their mental health, how do you expect someone in that distressed state to be able to find good work? I will defend politicians slightly, just slightly. We are there to advocate for people who cannot advocate for themselves, and we are there to protect the most vulnerable. I'll just repeat my argument that capitalism can generate wealth, it can make people prosper, but it can't make everyone prosper. And it didn't build the welfare state, it didn't build the NHS, and it didn't march and campaign for workers' rights. We all, the generations who went before us did it, and we all have to keep doing it to make sure that everyone prospers under capitalism. Thank you.
Reply, and I'm happy to welcome the second opposition speaker to continue the government reply. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your contributions and the points that you have raised. I am not here to defend socialism, communism, or anything else, but I would say and stand by my position that capitalism have truly failed the most vulnerable people in our society. I'm talking about the environment of the wealthy nations being pristine because capitalism have helped them. Well, there is evidence, a lot of evidence to support the view that a lot of this waste from these wealthy nations are exported to poorer nations without disclosing their real content, which is why in certain cases you have pristine environment. We have heard about the innovations around mobile phones, and probably we haven't heard it though, electric cars, and talked about the environment and the fact that wealthier nations are able to, keep the environment cleaner, but at what cost? 60% of the global cobalt is extracted from DRC at a very unsustainable level. There's presence of slave labor. When I say slave labor, even child labor, so that wealthier nations can meet their goals of mitigating the impact of climate change, for example. And this is happening not just because it should happen or the press for clean energy, but because it is driven by capitalist ideology of chasing profit and not distributing wealth equitably. There is evidence to support that. I didn't want to go into, the historical or colonial relationship between capitalism and even the fact that the wealth of this very country where we stand is built by colonial wealth, which again wouldn't have been possible to even support some of their capitalist agenda today and some of the benefits that they still see. I've also heard about trade liberalization, which is something that has been linked to capitalism. But I also want to say that on the African continent at least, thanks to the Bretton Woods organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank that have imposed some of those ideologies to African countries that had borrowed money from them, a lot of those countries continue to be in debt. Some of the corrupt practices that is present in these countries today is thanks to some of those things that they introduced. I think not even at the theoretical level, in practice and based on so many other evidence that of course due to time or limitations of time, I'm not able to present. But I want to conclude by, I think there was someone that talked about health and well-being, and I want to more or less personalize the perspective I'm going to bring by saying that capitalism have actually not necessarily resulted in us making more money or bringing about better well-being or good mental health, because it allows you to overwork and become underpaid. The take-home pay, even as a university lecturer here in St. Andrews, despite how much you pay as students for the students that are here, is not enough to take some of us home. And this is because, well, the university has to make profits. I'm sure you all, or some of you must have been affected by the strikes. You know the reason for the strikes. And so I am actually going to personalize this perspective by saying that capitalism has truly failed us. And whilst I would not say that socialism is the way to go, I will make a case for a more equitable distribution of wealth, because it's easier to say that capitalism is better for Britain, but capitalism might be better for Britain because there are some invisible consequences in other countries that you are not seeing. And based on my research, that more or less centers around the link between depleting resources, natural resource extraction, and insecurity in most of the countries in West and Central Africa. I stand here to say that capitalism has failed most vulnerable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, proposition speaker, for letting me slide, and thank you to all members who have contributed to this fine debate. It's now time to call the House to a vote. So, please raise your hand nice and high if you vote in the proposition that you believe that capitalism has failed vulnerable groups. And then please raise your hand if you vote the opposition that you believe that capitalism has not failed vulnerable groups.
Raise two hands.
And please raise your hand if you abstain from voting. is the first time that Alex and I have agreed on all the totals. Before the votes are announced, I'm happy to call on Jenny to give the first set of announcements.
Hello. My name's Jenny. I'm head of the public debates, which just means that I'm in charge of the committee that organises these events. I just want to thank the speakers for what was an excellent debate, and particularly Rick and Scott for coming at such short notice as well. It was really great that you were able to come. I want to thank Alex in particular, our Sergeant at Arms, for organising this week entirely off her own back. It's not an easy thing to engage speakers, and we often rely on speakers' kind of altruism and their word to say they're going to turn up. It doesn't always happen, so it's really great that Alex has taken it upon himself to kind of organise this week and managed to get such brilliant speakers. It's lovely to see you all here, especially to see some new faces as well, and I would encourage you, if this is your first debate, to definitely come back and check out the other kinds of debates that we run. There's no debate next week because it's Raisin and it's reading week, and we're all either crying over essays or going home and getting home cooked meals for the first time in weeks. The first week that we will have another debate is in week 7. We're doing a really exciting collaboration with the St Mary's College Society. We're running a motion, This House Believes in the Separation of Church and State. So that'll be a really interesting one. We've got some really good lecturers from the university to come and speak for that as well. We also have one on AI after that, if anyone's interested. So thank you all so much for coming. Lovely to see you all, and we look forward to seeing you again after reading week.
Hi, I'm William. I help run the competitive side of the society. So if you're interested in debating with these amazing debaters here, we run training at Wednesdays at 2 o'clock at the top floor of the Union. Obviously taking a break for Independent Learning Week in week 7. Feel free to join us. We teach you how to do parliamentary debating. It's all good, all fun. If you're interested in attending competitions, feel free to come up to me afterwards. We send people to competitions usually every weekend. We don't have Bogle anymore. But we also have internal competitions like Cubs, where if you're a novice, we can help partner with another novice and just have a nice, fun internal competition. Debating is fun, believe me, true, it is. 6 years, 6 years in the making. Yeah.
And then finally, Freddie.
Last week you gave my full name, now are we doing the name I go by?
Well, I said Will as a contraction.
You start calling Jenny Jen?
Yes.
That's already a contraction.
Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm the Social Secretary. I have 2 announcements tonight, exciting times. The first one is, if any of you, which all of you will know if you follow the 1794 Ball Instagram account.
Woohoo!
This is how you get crowd engagement, Joe. Which is that we've announced when ticket sales will go up for the annual 1794 Ball, and early bird tickets go on sale on the 23rd of October.
22nd.
No, 23rd. Monday the 23rd, don't correct me. And then the rest of the ticket, and then our general release will be on the Thursday the 26th of October, which will be just after that, our first public debate back after reading week. So that's my first announcement. The second one is, of course, after this debate we'll go, as we do every week, to Sandy's Bar, where we have our post-debate reception. Good opportunity to have a drink, have a discussion about tonight's debate. As always, the invitation is open to our wonderful speakers to come along and join us. They're able to. Other than that, we have a designated sober person at all of our events. This week it is the lovely Charlotte. Other than that, hopefully we'll see you all there.
Now to announce the results of the debate. We have a total of 63 votes. The ayes to the right are 41, noes to the left are 10, and we have 12 abstentions. Therefore, congratulations to the proposition bench. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully see you in week 7. And yes, come to the pub. Fun, 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 fun.